Hello everyone and welcome to the third workshop video for Healing Stories, How to Write About Your PANS PANDAS Journey. My name is Quinn and today I'm going to be talking to you about poetry. Poetry in particular is really great for self-expression because it doesn't have to be fully coherent. Thoughts can be disjointed, they can be fragmented, you don't have to pay attention to grammar as much. You can pour out your heart and soul onto the page without thinking about full sentences. There are so many possibilities when it comes to poetry, and just so you're aware, it doesn't actually have to rhyme. There are so many things you can do with the structure, with the length. Poetry is also typically the shortest form of short form writing, so it takes typically less time to write a poem. So if you're short on time but you still want to try writing as a tool for healing, then I would suggest trying poetry just because it takes less time to actually get down on the page. There's no right or wrong way to use poetry to heal, but here are some of the things that I have tried and have found they've really helped me. I've described my experience with a metaphor or an analogy. I've talked about big feelings that I'm too afraid to actually speak about, so I write them down instead. I'll put thought after thought on the page, and then I'll take a look at all of them to see if there's anything that's connecting all of these thoughts. You can write a condensed version of your journey and use just a couple lines to cover each event, but be poetic about it instead of focusing on specific details. Or you could try writing about a specific moment in time rather than your entire journey and just focus on the big emotions. And like with a lot of writing, it's good to use imagery to try to evoke the same emotion that you were feeling at the time. So now I'm going to get into some common types of poetry to give you an idea of something you might want to try. First up, we've got lyrical poetry, which is probably what you're picturing when I say the word poetry. Lyrical poetry is written in verse, so you're using lines, and then those groups of lines are called stanzas. So over on the right, I have the example in Flanders Fields. Those are 3 stanzas right there because there are 3 groups of lines. Lyrical poetry typically uses enjambment, which is when the line gets cut off midway instead of going all the way to the end of the page and then continuing. There are different kinds of lyrical poetry. There's really old styles like ballad and sonnet and epic. The most modern type of lyrical poetry that's done a lot today is free verse, and that's the one I would suggest you try. Free verse does not have any set rules or structure. You can do whatever you want. Another cool type of poetry is called prose poetry, which is when you write poetry but in paragraph form. So prose is when you use paragraphs and sentences. It's what you would typically read in a novel. And with prose poetry, it just means you're writing poetry, but you're using that format. So I'll read a little bit from this poem that I really like called Mama Said Wedding Crowns. Mama said wedding crowns, and I looked at the type bouquets, dark white, forbidding, portraits of ancient weddings, too serious, the groom stiff, the bride boxed, like a doll, adorned with rhinestones. That sounds like poetry, because it is poetry, but when you look at it, it's not maybe what you expect poetry to look like because it doesn't have lines, it has sentences. Prose poetry is often written in full sentences, but grammar is still not a huge issue. It doesn't typically use enjambment. However, if you want to do a hybrid of some paragraphs and some enjambed lines, then that's a cool thing to try. A specific type of lyrical poem is song. I've separated it from lyrical poetry though because a huge difference between song and any other type of lyrical poem is that there is music that goes with song. So typically there's a lot more emphasis on how the words sound rather than what the words mean. If you've listened to any songs on the radio, you might have noticed that there isn't a lot of meaning to what they're singing about, although there are a lot of songs that do have a lot of meaning to their lyrics. There's often a lot of end rhyme, meaning that there's rhyming at the end of every line. There's also quite a bit of repetition, especially since choruses are often repeated as well as verses. If you're a musician, this is a great option for you. If you want to try writing about your PANS PANDAS journey but don't want to bother with writing lyrics, you can also try to capture your emotion through just music and just score an instrumental piece. To the right, I have an example from the song I Deserve to Bleed. This is the chorus. I want to be torn apart excruciatingly. I punish my body because it's not good enough for me. The scary thoughts are spreading like a weed, the thoughts that say that I deserve to bleed. Personally, I find that the song I Deserve to Bleed describes a lot of my PANS PANDAS experience, so if you want to try writing a song that has all of that emotional turmoil, then feel free. Another interesting form is lyric essay. Lyric essay is when your non-fictional story is written in verse or with poetic language. You can do it lyrical or you can do it in prose. But the goal here is to write what actually happened to you, but you're doing it kind of like a poem. It's often longer than your typical poem. I've seen people write lyric essays that span across a lot of pages, but it's also commonly a shorter way to write a non-fictional piece because you're not using often full sentences. You could use full sentences, but when you do, you are going to be focusing on more poetic language. I feel like lyric essay would be a good intro to poetry because you don't necessarily need to have a lot of imagery. You could have a lot of imagery, but you don't need it. It's also based on real events, so you don't have to think of any kind of plot. You can leave out details and just focus on emotional moments, and I find it could be a very healing experience to see your journey, especially if it was a traumatic journey, to see it as a beautiful work of art. And within all of those different types of poetry, there's numerous different ways that you could write those poems. You could stylize it with end rhyme for a more lighthearted poem. You can still have a serious poem that has end rhyme, but typically when you read a poem that has a lot of rhyming, it sounds a little bit more lighthearted. I would pay attention to diction, which is your word choice, because certain connotations of words have an emotional impact. For example, let's use the word laughter. It's very light and bright, and if I were to use it in the context of a birthday party, saying everyone was laughing and having a good time, that would make sense. But if I were to take a synonym and say everybody at this birthday party was cackling, that might have a little bit of a different connotation. You might start wondering, are they cackling because they're witches? Are they cackling because they're evil? Are they cackling because they're bullying someone? You might not think of it as happy. So paying attention to those connotations can change the emotional impact. Poems can be as long or as short as you want. I've seen poems that span across entire books. A lot of epics tend to be book length. You also could have a very short poem. I've seen poems that are only 2 lines long, and haikus, which is a very specific structure, is only 3 lines. You can write with full sentences and using proper punctuation, or you could write in fragments. The structure that you take often does influence the emotional impact as well. Punctuation often gives it a more structured feel and is a bit more clear. But if you're writing about something like Pans or Pandas that is confusing and overwhelming, if you write without punctuation, that can make the poem feel overwhelming and confusing, which mimics the feeling of Pans and Pandas. So I'm now going to go over some of the basics of poetic devices, not because I'm expecting you to remember any of these, but because I think it would give you some ideas of things you can try in poetry. So imagery is one of the most important parts of any form of writing, which is what you want your reader to be picturing. The goal is to awaken the reader's senses by describing something either literally or figuratively, using the 5 different forms of sensory detail, which is sound, sight, taste, smell, and touch. A simile is the comparison between 2 or more things with saying the words like or as. So saying she's as pretty as a picture, or she's pretty like a picture. A metaphor is similar, but it's when you compare 2 or more things without saying like or as. So she was an ocean sweeping across the land. So the difference between simile and metaphor is that simile is acknowledging the fact that it is figurative. She's like a picture. She's not a picture, but she's like a picture. Versus a metaphor is not acknowledging the fact that it's figurative. She was a picture, essentially. An analogy is what I like to call an extended metaphor, even though that's not what most people call it. It's when you use one scenario to represent something else, to prove a point or explain a concept. You can have really short analogies like life is like a box of chocolates from Forrest Gump. Or you can have very long analogies that span across the entirety of a poem. You also can see a lot of analogies used in movies. For example, The Little Mermaid could be interpreted as an allegory for feeling out of place and not belonging in your current setting. Analogies often are left up to interpretation. Juxtaposition is when you place 2 contrasting images together to create an interesting effect. For example, she smiled warmly as she nestled into her pillow, unaware of the demon beneath her bed. The first image is kind of a nice and sweet image, but the second one is a little bit more terrifying. And the terrifying image makes the sweet image just seem more haunting. I often find that with juxtaposition, the second image that you show often overpowers the first image. That's not always the case, that's just what I've noticed a lot. An allusion is an indirect reference to something outside of the piece, like a person, place, or thing that your readers might know of. This is often said in passing, so the reader may or may not get the reference. For example, he continued forward, paying no attention to the man behind the curtain is an allusion to The Wizard of Oz. Repetition is quite self-explanatory. It's when you use the same word, phrase, symbol, image, sound, etc. more than once for effect. This is often done to emphasize something. Assonance, consonance, and alliteration are all versions of repetition in regards to sound. Assonance is the repetition of the same vowel sound. For example, sweet boy, eat your meal. The E sound is repeated. Consonance is the repetition of the same consonant sound. So, for example, wind whispers wonders in my ear. The W's are consonants, but the S's are also consonants. The whispers, wonders. Alliteration is a repetition of the same sound at the beginning of the word. So, fairies falling fearfully, that is a version of consonance, but it's also alliteration because it happens at the beginning of the word. Assonance and consonants can occur anywhere within the word, so the beginning, the middle, or the end of the word. And alliteration can be assonance or consonants, but it just means that it's at the beginning of the word. Personification is giving human-like characteristics to something that is not human. For example, the teacup seemed to wave at me. Teacups don't wave, humans wave. Onomatopoeia is when you use a word to imitate how sounds are heard. It's kind of representing a sound because words like ribbit, hiss, screech, those are not how those actually sound, it's just what we write to represent it. Symbolism is using one thing to represent another. For example, a heart often represents love. And a motif is just that same symbol that reoccurs multiple times throughout a piece. For example, if you wanted to use the heart as a symbol, it would become a motif if you kept using heart to represent love. So let's take a look at some examples. First up, I want to show a poem that I really love by Catherine Garbinski called Dragon Scales. It started with my stomach, one spot, hardly noticeable. That's how it happens. Slowly, imperceptibly, then all at once. I scratch thoughtlessly with my long nails, draw blood. When I remove my shirt, I do not recognize the creature underneath. In the shower, I take a stone and scratch at my skin, red and dry and itching. I imagine myself a dragon, sloughing off old scales to reveal soft, shimmering skin underneath. They call it a disease, but I call it a becoming. I cover my skin in charcoal, the smell of sulfur envelopes me. I wear long sleeves, try to hide myself, become small, but the smoke from our fire pit finds me no matter which way I move. In the morning, I find new scales. I no longer dread the change. A dragon's body inspires fear, yes, but also awe. Covered in scales, glittering sharp, when I move my body, I imagine wings, a chest full of fire. I am large and fierce. So pause this video, take a moment, and write down some things that you notice. Maybe something you like, something you don't like, something that really stands out to you. Okay, so assuming that you took that moment, here are some of my thoughts about dragon scales. So there's a lot of rich imagery about dragon-related things like fire and scales, etc. I would argue that the scales are a motif for change. I'd also argue that the dragon's body describing a disability is an analogy. I like the juxtaposition of they call it a disease, I call it a becoming, because disease is associated with decay versus becoming is associated with growth, so they're exact opposites. And mentioning a becoming and growth, essentially, after mentioning disease makes the growth seem a lot more impactful. I like the personification of the smoke from our fire pit finds me because smoke doesn't have eyes. It can't really find things. It makes it feel like whatever's happening to the speaker of this poem is not under their control. I also find it very interesting with the consonants of the repeated S and F sounds because the S sound kind of makes a hissing sound, and when you think of dragons, you think of smoke coming out of the nose, which makes a hissing sound. Or you could be imagining that feeling when you have a cut on your hand and water touches it, you kind of make a hissing sound. Another poem I found is called A Poem About Pain by David Budbill. I can feel myself slipping away, fading away, withdrawing from this life just as my father did. When the pain you're in is so great you can't think about or pay attention to anything but your own pain, the rest of the world and all other life don't matter. I think about my friends with dementia, cancer, arthritis, and how much more pain they are in than I am, but it does no good. Their pain is not mine, and therefore, no matter how magnanimous I might want to be, their pain is not as important to me as my own. Once again, take a second to kind of think about what sticks out to you. So, first off, what you might have noticed is the don't matter right in the middle of the poem. This is a very effective use of line breaks because don't matter sticks out, and it just so happens to be the entire point of the poem. After you read the title, A Poem About Pain, your eyes are immediately drawn to the words don't matter, so it makes you think that either the poem doesn't matter or the pain doesn't matter, which is what Budbill is trying to get across. That your pain only matters to you and it doesn't matter to other people. A poem about pain is conversational and direct and describes the poet's literal experience as opposed to what Dragon Scales does, which uses a fantasy image to convey something. There's the repetition of I can feel myself slipping away, fading away, but there's also the repetition of the word pain quite a lot, which kind of suggests that the pain is all-consuming. I find that this poem feels a lot like a journal entry because there isn't a lot of imagery, it's just the speaker telling you what's happened to them. So I have 2 exercises for you to try. The first one is more generalized. I call it a texture you'd rather forget. So step 1 would be think of the worst texture you've ever felt and then write about 10 words that describe that texture or how you feel about it. For example, I don't like the feeling of honey when it's on my fingers, so I would describe honey as slimy, gross, sticky, golden, viscous, etc. And then step 2 would be to write a poem using as many of those words as possible. For example, I took many of the words that I did from the last slide and wrote this poem. Sweet, syrupy stickiness grossly engulfing my fingers as I make tea for sickly feelings. Shiny, golden grime deceives. To the tongue, it's tasty treasure, but to skin, it's a viciously slimy viscosity. Another exercise that's a little bit more emotionally charged would be to think about some kind of pain you've been experiencing, whether it be emotional or physical, and then I invite you to try to write a short poem about it, either using figurative imagery like Garbinsky does in Dragon Scales, or being more literal like Budbill does in a poem about pain. A prompt that I had the workshop members try at home was to write a poem from the perspective of PANS PANDAS. This one might take a little bit more time. If Pans or Pandas was its own separate entity, would it be thinking something? Would it have a goal? Is it meaning to be hurtful? Is it apologetic? Is it human-like? Or is it a monster? Or is it the spiritual thing following you around? Perceive Pans or Pandas however you'd like. There are no wrong answers. I just invite you to try picturing it as a separate thing and then writing a persona poem. So that's all I have for you today. The next workshop will be how to make zines, which are these little booklets. So if you want more information about that, you can visit the link down below, or you could email me at quinlan@inflamebrain.org to RSVP. Thank you for joining me, and as always, good luck on your writing journey.